Okay, I had such a good time doing the first two. I decided I want to do a third one. This is probably going to be my last one for the night. I actually have to get some writing on new stuff done, and I've been putting it off. But well, actually, have been, I guess, productive in a sense while putting it off. This is another story from Tales from an Apartment. Once again, available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere else ebooks are sold. If you're seeing this on Facebook, feel free to respond. I love comments, and I'm open to negative and positive criticism. So I'm not offended so long as it's actual criticism, not just, hey, you suck, or something silly like that. This is called the B side. And actually, I remember a little bit about this story. I published this in 2012, so this is like somewhere around 8 years ago. So I've forgotten a lot, but I think I had all the stories written that I wanted, and then when I looked everything over, I realized I needed to have one more story. I don't know why. I can't remember specifically why, but I felt like I needed one more story, and then I came up with the B side, and this probably is the scariest. If I can say I can write a scary story, this is probably the scariest of all the stories in the whole book. Hope you like it. Yet again, I'd love to hear what you think about it, one way or the other. Once again, this is the B side from Tales from an Apartment. When Henry awoke, Velma was dead. To his credit, he knew this not by the glazed look in her eye or her slack, unhinged mouth. She'd looked like that many times first thing in the morning. No, he knew because for the first time in almost 30 years of marriage, she hadn't clapped an icy hand onto his wrist the second before he rolled out of bed. Well, good morning, Velma, Henry said to his dead wife, propped up on his elbow. She stared at the ceiling in reply. And how did you rest, dear? He said, nodding as if she were actually responding. He wondered if he were breaking some sort of taboo, teasing the dead, but didn't really care. It was about time she died. Henry hadn't felt this alive in, well, ever. It was as if for 30 years his life had been poured into two glasses, but now he had the full glass to himself. First, he would need to call the police, then a funeral home, he supposed, and maybe the few remaining cousins of hers spread throughout the country. The Marlowe women were far and few between, but of hardy stock. They didn't go down easy. So far as he knew, all the ones over the age of 50 were widows. Those lucky men. Velma's mother was already dead by the time he'd met her, but the old woman had been a hearty 70-something and had only died because she'd had separate falls down the same flight of stairs within minutes of each other before being stabbed 17 times. Even then, the old bat, Velma's words, not Henry's, had clung onto the last few scraps of life in the hospital for 2 weeks. It had taken a combination of multiple injuries and a staph infection to finally take Velma's mother out. As he dried himself from the shower, he glanced over at the picture Velma had insisted stay on his nightstand. Her hated mother, who had somehow become sainted in death, stared at him with the same impassive hatred he'd had to bear witness to upon waking every morning. But today, those eyes didn't have the same anchoring despair pulling down his insides as on other days. Velma was 30 when they'd married, and over the process of the last several decades, she'd blossomed into a carbon copy of the gaunt, crow faced, scowling woman who'd eyed him to sleep with that gray expression and jolted him awake in the morning. She could easily have been a stand in for her mother had she been too ill to fulfill her duties in hell. He'd put that picture framed face down many times during the night, but somehow Velma had sensed it and put it back up, or it had crawled upright in a feet of beyond the grave hate well. Henry felt entirely too good. He looked at Velma, still in her state of rictus, and was slightly crestfallen that this could have been a dream. Good wasn't a word he'd used too often in his life, or rather, all the power in the word had been drained out. Dinner was good. The movie was good. Her outfit was good. The lovemaking, on rare and strictly regimented encounters, was good. He looked at his wife, willing her to move, almost expecting her to lurch upright, screaming or leap onto the wall and crawl across the ceiling. That brought a smile. No, this was real. And if it wasn't, he had nothing to look forward to but more of this awful life anyway, so he may as well enjoy it. You know, dear, he began, fishing boxers and knee socks out of his drawer, you do so much. You should really take a day for yourself. Stay in bed, watch TV, order a pizza. You never admitted it, but I know you like that show Cheaters. He caught sight of himself through the corner of his eye in the mirror. Henry stood straight and looked at his naked body. He'd really let himself go. His saggy belly had creased underneath it had grown so large. Henry still had a full head of hair, but Velma had always insisted on this shaggy cut that swallowed his ears in a thick, curly thicket of gray and faded red. His noodly arms didn't have an ounce of muscular definition. Velma had ridiculed him for any time he'd tried to exercise, and he'd somehow managed a tan that faded upward from his wrists. He thought about it a moment. She'd ridiculed him whenever he'd done anything to improve himself. But she'd maintained that hard, unfeminine body of hers. Twice a week for the last 30 years she'd gone dancing, had forced him to dance the first 10 years until it had become obvious he was a hopeless, graceless, foot-clubbing, two left-footed beast. Henry scowled at his reflection and began stripping on his clothes. Velma had already put out his clothes for the day, a striped, short-sleeved thing with brown tweed pants that always itched his crotch. No, he said, I'm not going to wear this. He threw the shirt on the floor and went to the dresser, fishing around in the bottom drawer until he found the pair of blue jeans he remembered there. He could wear them as long as he paid the dollar at work for whatever this month's charity was. Velma hadn't approved of dressing down at work. Henry put the jeans on and topped them with a gray t-shirt. It had a small bleach stain on one sleeve, but that made it more appealing to him. He looked at himself in the mirror and thought he recognized that guy. Those were his clothes, all right, and his silly haircut and his bowling ball of a gut stretching against the shirt, but the twinkle in his eyes and the too wide smile were on loan from somebody else. Henry combed his hair in the opposite direction Velma had always tugged it down in, and promptly left their apartment without the lunch his wife had made for him or even a goodbye. He had $6 or so in his pocket, but he was going to use his debit card at a fast food restaurant, and he wasn't going to put the transaction in the register. If Velma had been in her grave already, she would have been spitting in it. Henry came home happy. He had an awful job with horrible coworkers and customers coming to the counter who constantly found new ways to degrade and revolt him, but today it had all washed off him. The worst part of any day prior, by far, was over. Henry had come to a sudden realization and had consequently developed a new credo. Ever since he could remember, he'd lived his life on the B-side. He thought that up while pondering over his life and how exactly he'd gotten to where he was. He'd had a favorite song back before Velma had crushed his love of music by taking a tack hammer to records he'd had since his teens, back when the world still listened to vinyl. Henry couldn't remember the name or the artist, but he remembered how that song had made him feel. It had been on the B-side of a record lost somewhere in time. And then it had hit him that he'd been on the B-side of life, and he'd lost himself somewhere in time. If he'd ever had himself to begin with, that was. But today, new Henry had been born, and he had held every inch of himself. From now on, Henry would live his life on the A side. "Honey, I'm home," he said, but he clapped a hand over his mouth. His voice had been too loud, had carried too far. It had scared him for some reason. The apartment had a sudden hollowness to it not present before, like all the furniture had been removed and was set out before him, was only an optic illusion. He stood there for a moment, holding his breath and wondering if Velma had played a trick on him. Of course, that was ridiculous. A-side Henry shrugged his shoulders and fluffed the back of his hair. He'd gotten it cut into a mullet, half as a joke. Velma hated jokes of any kind, practical or otherwise. Instead, she preferred tests. Velma loved giving Henry pop quizzes, presenting him with two options and pouring scorn over him until he inevitably withered and picked the wrong one. Like when she'd caught him masturbating in the bathroom and had tortured him with a storm of questions, finally settling on asking if it was better for him to touch himself or sleep with another woman. Touch myself? He guessed, and Velma had tut-tutted, shaking her head as if he were a child who just misunderstood a lesson. She'd proceeded to explain to him that touching himself was a waste of seed, and that it was surely a selfish act, that hands were meant for labor and not self-labor. She'd spoken with all the fury and self-righteousness of a Southern Baptist minister. He'd wanted to remind her that they'd never had children, but when Velma interrogated and explained, there was no room for rebuttal. When a verdict was delivered, no appeal, and when a sentence pronounced, no stay of execution. There had been no option this morning. He'd simply gotten up, seen his wife was dead, and then proceeded to get ready for work and leave. But still his insides were steeped in boiling hot dread. "Velma," he said, a mouse again. B-side Henry was somewhere behind him, waiting to take the wheel. He knew better, but he supposed it was like a battered spouse. Even being free of an abuser, it was easy to fall back into the old habit of obedience. Henry was afraid of his wife. He could never have cheated on her for fear of what consequence would befall him. But it was more than that. More than just her he was afraid of. Henry was also in terror of her womanness. It was part of the reason it had taken so long for him to marry. He'd tried talking to girls as a teenager, but words had always turned into foreign objects falling out of his mouth and shattering his confidence. It hadn't helped with their accessorizing the laughing with whispers behind his back, or even worse, to his face, or having hair to wash with matching expectant phone calls as excuses as to why they really would have liked to, but simply couldn't go out to the fair with him, or wherever else they couldn't go with him. And in the face of all that rejection, he'd never been able to understand why he wanted them so badly. He'd been nothing but powerless to any girl or woman who'd asked anything of him, had simply given in to their inherent authority and bought lunches, lent pens. Anything of him had simply been given in to their inherent authority and bought lunches, lent pens that never came back, or did homework for girls who couldn't have guessed what his name was. Velma had been different, not in her derision, but that she had actually given him the time of day. That was really how they'd met. She'd walked up to him and told him the time. And not only that, but she'd actually pursued him, told him on their third date that he would marry her. By their fourth date, she'd had a date picked out and the type of ring, which he couldn't afford, he would buy. A half-carat teardrop. She'd accompanied him to the jeweler of her choice to make sure he purchased the right one. If he could just see her there, still in bed, he could attempt to soothe the shaken A-side Henry. He deserved a chance to live. He steeled himself and stormed through the living room, down the narrow hall between the bathroom and kitchen, and into the bedroom. Henry tried to spot her in the roll of covers of the unmade bed and thought for an instant he saw her, but no, she wasn't there. He flattened against the nearest wall. Henry wanted to run away, but something told him it would be worse, that whatever had happened to his wife's dead body would be more of a bane to him if he didn't face up to it now. Something was making noise in the bathroom. He could hear it in there, clacking. It could have been a thief. He didn't know. They didn't live in the safest neighborhood, but as soon as he thought this, he knew it wasn't true. There was still the initial problem of the dead body a thief would have to creep past. Anyone not a necrophiliac would have hightailed it out. especially had that dead body been Velma's. No, it was her. Not as dead as she was supposed to be after all. B-side Henry sighed heavily and scraped off the wall before slinking around the corner of the bathroom. She was standing there, but standing wasn't quite the right word. It appeared as though she were being held upright by someone who wasn't there. She was leaned slightly back, her head lolled to the side. Her hands were on the sink, her mouth still hung open the same as this morning, her eyes still bugged out of her head. She still looked dead. Velma? Henry said again, confused. What are you doing? Then those bug eyes swiveled over. He could almost hear them squeak in their sockets, fixing on the point in the mirror where they locked on the reflection of him in the mirror. The mouth stretched down farther, then snatched back up. Her lips peeled back from her teeth and snapped back in place. Hoo, she said. Ha-hoo! But she hadn't been the only voice he'd heard. Underneath that voice had been another one. He replayed that voice in his head mentally, stripping the whistle voice that had carried it. What are you wearing? It had said. He shook his head, the truth of whatever was going on in front of him still not sinking in. Jeans, he said. She turned around, a motion that looked more like two uncoordinated dance partners, but the one leading wasn't visible to the naked eye. She was propped up on the sink, but her upper body was bent like it was hung from a string in the ceiling. Her feet uncrossed themselves, the lips and mouth began to work, stopped. The head came up and the eyes, still pointed to the right, turned straight ahead and back onto Henry. The lips moved again, fixing into what looked like a smile, but could just as easily have been the facial expression that accompanied a scream. Ah. Those are not the clothes I put out for you, Henry, the underneath voice said. I won't, blah. Were you trying to get fired, or did you only want to waste my time? B-side Henry whimpered. Another pair of options. All at once, it came crashing down on him this was real. Velma was dead, but somehow she had hung on. Somehow she was right there, dead, but not. The Marlowe women were hardy indeed. Velma's body wrenched off the sink and reached for him. Ice-cold fingers scraped down the side of his face, dented his narrow chest as the club of an arm swung back to her its side. Velma's body straightened, and again it looked like an invisible dance partner doing all the work. A bare foot clapped forward on the linoleum floor. Ooh-wah-hag. He'd almost understood that one even without the undervoice. Give us a hug was always the first thing she'd said to him after he came home. Henry took a step back. Velma's other foot followed the first. She slumped into the door, but rose, stiff-legged, without using hands. Her head snapped left and right, the eyes rolling around lazily until they settled on him. Sa-what? Damn right something was wrong. A-side and B-side Henry agreed on that one. You're dead, Henry shouted, backing all the way to the bedroom door. Velma threw her hands out, clubbing after him like a person on stilts. She didn't almost fall this time, only staggered like a drunk with a spine made of silly putty. He stepped back just as she threw an arm at his head, smacking her wrist against the threshold. Each finger laced around the doorway, then her arm pulled the rest of her forward. Her eyes were already fixed on him, and with each passing second, Velma was getting better at this puppetry thing. Ah, diah. I'm dead, Henry. Help. Henry's skin prickled. In life, Velma had never asked for help before. Oop, hang on. Lost my place. He was on the verge of running, but then he found himself intrigued by his wife for the first time in many years. How do you suppose? I'd do that. Then she held out her hand to him, and surprisingly, he took it. Henry didn't know if this was A side or B side, but he led her through the kitchen to the dining table and helped her to sit. She was more coordinated, but allowed herself to be supported by him. Wahapa! He put a hand over the cold lump that was hers. I don't know. I guess you just passed away sometime in the night. Away? The eyes rolled up to meet his. He nodded. The face was completely devoid of emotion, but somehow he could feel her pain. He squeezed that cold lump, hoping that she somehow could feel what he felt. What now? Henry was taken back even further. He couldn't remember the last time she'd asked him for advice. This just didn't happen. I guess we call 911? I mean, the police will need to know. Then I suppose a funeral home or something comes to get your body. The eyes slowly narrowed, left, then right. You leave me. What? You're not leave me. You're not leaving me. That's not what I meant. I mean, that's not how I meant it. I would never leave you, Henry pled. But when I woke up, you're already like that. I thought I would take care of you after I came home, see? So you love me? So you left me like that? The under voice said. Velma's body stood so suddenly it knocked the chair over. Henry looked up at all 6 foot 2 inches of her, 168 pounds of gristle and muscle. She'd been proud of maintaining her dancer's body since high school. The eyes were already fixed on him. He fell out of the chair and rolled into the kitchen, banging his knees and his hip, barely staying out of her lengthy reach. Her body spun, the eyes quickly locking on him again. Velma, wait, he said. Dirty boy. Her body croaked. His brain quickly translated the inner voice. You're a dirty boy, Henry. Already thinking about your whores with a loving wife at home dead. If you had touched yourself, maybe you wouldn't have such filthy thoughts. But you said it was wrong to touch myself, B-side Henry whined, crab walking on the kitchen floor. He pulled himself up on the edge of the sink, his hand slipping inside to grab the knife in a reverse grip. Velma had left last night after making his sandwiches. Henry hated sandwiches. Her body took a long, wrenching step in his direction and was only an inch away. Without looking, he slashed across her middle. Ha dia ooh. Henry didn't wait for the translation. He slashed through her chest in the other direction, an oval of pale, freckly skin exposed beneath her nightgown. He caught a peak of dark brown nipple as Velma's body jerked forward at the waist, reaching for him with both hands. Nah, ha, tush. Now I touched myself, Henry. I touched myself all over. He kicked a hand away as it grasped at his feet. Velma's body fell to its knees with a dull crunch, and it pinned him to the floor by its hips. He tried to wriggle free, but he was struck like an ant trapped beneath a sadistic child's finger. She began climbing up his body with her palms, coming dangerously close to straddling him. I tush you too. No! Henry screamed and thunked the butt of the knife off her body's forehead. Its eyes turned ceilingward, and he knew momentarily that Velma was blind. The hand missed his chest and planted on the floor beside him. He used the extra space to reel back and hit Velma's jaw with the knife. Her jaw cracked and slunk on one side, her tongue flopping out of her mouth. A thick something hung in the air, slow motion dripping off her tongue as she leaned in like she was going to tongue him. Henry brought the knife back up and sank it into her body's eye socket. It didn't seem to register that Velma's body had been wounded. The one eye rolled down, and he hammered the bottom of his fist on the butt of the knife again. Velma's body collapsed on top of him, the butt hitting him in the chest and driving even deeper into her skull. she said after a long moment. Henry understood and was frightened all over again. A-side Henry had just been born. It was too soon for him to die. But die he would because Velma had just assured B-side Henry was here to stay. She'd been dead several hours, and he just butchered her body. Even if he weren't somehow linked to her death, he would be the husband who had hacked up the corpse of the woman he'd been married to for 27 years. Nobody would touch A-side Henry now. He would wither on the vine and die. The voice coming out of Velma's body was distant and weak. Unless... What, Velma? Henry asked. She was almost gone. Stay? Stay where? He felt invisible hands between them, groping him, trying to pull him away. He tried to push her off, but she was much too heavy. What are you doing? No, Velma, no! And then those icy, unseen hands were reaching under his clothes and into him, a dozen hands grabbing hold of every corner and snatching him out by the roots from his own body. He briefly saw himself through the remaining eye of Velma's body. They tumbled down away. He didn't know where, but she was wrapped all around him, and he was twined around her. When he awoke, it was dark. It took a lot of rocking and shoving, but finally, he got the body off him. He trudged into the bathroom across the kitchen and flicked on the light. It was like 1,000 daggers in his brain, and when his eyes eventually adjusted, the man staring at him looked like he was suffering from the world's worst hangover. Henry opened his mouth to yawn, stretching as he did so. His bones snapped. Now I touch you, Velma's voice said under his own. A hand clamped down over his and lifted it into the air. There was no one else's reflection in the mirror, but he could feel Velma behind him. Slowly, the invisible hand twirled him around and around. He tried to stop, but another hand and another grabbed and twisted, pushing him along. Henry was spun out of the bathroom and into the narrow hall, then pulled close against nothing and thrust backward in a dip. He looked at Velma's body, still dead in the kitchen, looking somewhat like a deflated balloon. Then his hand was yanked up like he was waving hello, and he felt pressure at his hip before he began a seemingly one-man foxtrot into the living room. A-side Henry screamed. B-side Henry was cowering somewhere in a corner. And that is the end. I might do a couple more of these. For whatever reason, I'm really enjoying doing this. I wasn't expecting to like doing this as much as I have been. I hope you stay tuned. Once again, this is Tales from an Apartment, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and anywhere else ebooks are sold. I hope you download a copy. I hope you download a copy of all my other books as well. By all means, leave me a comment on Facebook, Twitter. I'm even on Instagram as Melted Brain Books. I hope to hear from you. Thank you. Talk to you soon.